The hospital intake nurse noticed the small scars on the ambulance driver's hands during a routine check, surgical precision marks that didn't match someone who learned on the job. When she quietly asked about them, the woman's answer changed everything. "Every scar is a life I couldn't save in Helmand Province. Welcome to Hidden Legends." Before we begin this incredible story of a quiet ambulance driver whose gentle hands once performed life-saving surgery in the world's most dangerous combat zones, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that true healers never stop serving, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who save lives from the shadows. The emergency room at St. Mary's General Hospital never truly slept, but the hours between 2 and 6 a.m. carried a different weight. It was during these quiet hours that Sarah Martinez preferred to work, driving the night shift ambulance routes through the city's forgotten corners. She had been doing this job for 3 years now, ever since she'd moved to Denver and needed something that would pay the bills without asking too many questions about her past. Sarah was unremarkable in the way that made her invisible. Average height, brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, scrubs that had seen better days. The other EMTs and paramedics barely noticed her, except to acknowledge that she was reliable, punctual, and never complained about taking the difficult calls. She drove with steady hands and spoke in measured tones, never panicking even when the radio crackled with the worst kind of emergencies. Tonight felt different, though. Sarah could sense it in the way the dispatcher's voice carried an edge of tension in the unusual number of units being called out simultaneously. As she guided the ambulance through the empty streets, her partner Jake fumbled with his equipment checklist for the third time in 10 minutes. "You nervous about something?" Sarah asked, keeping her eyes on the road. Jake was fresh out of EMT training, barely 22 years old, with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Sarah of soldiers on their first deployment. He meant well, but he hadn't yet learned that confidence came from experience, not energy. "Just want to be ready," Jake replied, checking his radio again. "Dispatch said we might get called to that multi-vehicle accident on Highway 36. Sounds pretty serious." Sarah nodded but didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that preparing for trauma meant staying calm, not staying busy. As they pulled into the hospital bay to restock supplies, she noticed Nurse Patricia Williams at the intake desk, reviewing charts with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was expecting a difficult night. Patricia had been working emergency medicine for 15 years, and she possessed the rare combination of clinical expertise and human compassion that made her invaluable during crisis situations. She also had an eye for details that others missed, which is why she noticed Sarah's hands as the ambulance driver signed the routine equipment transfer forms. "These look interesting," Patricia said casually, gesturing toward Sarah's hands as she set down the clipboard. "Those are some precise scars. Medical training?" Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment. The scars were small, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Thin white lines across her knuckles, a curved mark near her left thumb, and the telltale pattern on her fingertips that came from years of working with surgical instruments under less than ideal conditions. "Something like that," Sarah replied, pulling her hands back slightly. Patricia had seen enough medical professionals to recognize the difference between scars earned in a controlled environment and those acquired under pressure. These weren't the marks of someone who had learned to suture in a classroom. They were the evidence of field work, of medicine practiced when seconds mattered and sterile conditions were a luxury. "I was an Army medic before this," Patricia continued, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "Deployed to Iraq twice. You develop a certain eye for recognizing your own kind." Sarah met her gaze directly for the first time. "I'm just an ambulance driver, Patricia, nothing more." But Patricia had already seen what she needed to see. The way Sarah held herself when discussing medical procedures, the unconscious assessment she made of every patient they brought in, the calm efficiency with which she handled emergency situations. This wasn't someone who had simply learned on the job. This was someone with serious training trying very hard to blend into the background. Before Patricia could probe further, the radio erupted with static and urgent voices. All units! All units! Major incident on Highway 36. Multi-vehicle collision with at least 6 casualties. Mass casualty protocols in effect. Repeat. Mass casualty protocols in effect. Jake jumped to his feet, adrenaline already flooding his system. That's us, Sarah. We need to move. Sarah was already walking toward the ambulance, her demeanor shifting in subtle ways that Patricia recognized immediately. The casual slouch disappeared, replaced by the precise posture of someone switching into operational mode. Her movements became more economical, her scan of the equipment more systematic. "Be careful out there," Patricia called after them. Sarah paused at the ambulance door and looked back. For just a moment, their eyes met across the emergency bay, and Patricia saw something that confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't the look of someone driving toward their first major incident. This was the expression of someone who had seen far worse and was preparing to do whatever needed to be done. The scene on Highway 36 was chaos in its purest form. 3 vehicles had collided during a sudden snowstorm, with 2 more cars unable to stop in time, adding to the destruction. The first ambulance was already on scene, and Sarah could see the lead paramedic, Marcus Rodriguez, trying to coordinate triage while dealing with multiple critical patients. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered as they approached. "Look at that mess." Sarah had already conducted her own assessment of the scene, automatically cataloging injury patterns, evacuation routes, and resource requirements. It was a skill set that had been drilled into her during months of training that officially never happened, refined during deployments that weren't supposed to exist. "Focus on what you can control," she told Jake as they grabbed their equipment. "Marcus will assign us sectors, follow his lead, and stay calm." Marcus waved them toward the overturned SUV, where 2 passengers were trapped. "Driver's unconscious, possible traumatic brain injury. Passengers got a compound fracture and significant bleeding. We need to get them stabilized for transport." Jake moved toward the vehicle, but Sarah was already there, her hands assessing the situation with a precision that made Marcus pause mid-instruction. She had evaluated both patients' conditions, identified the most immediate threats, and begun coordinating their extraction before Jake had even opened his medical kit. "Driver's breathing is shallow but steady," Sarah reported, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone giving a field report. "Pupil response suggests concussion, but no immediate signs of intracranial pressure. Passenger's bleeding is venous, not arterial. We can control that with direct pressure and elevation." Marcus stared at her. In 15 years of emergency medicine, he had never heard an ambulance driver provide that level of clinical assessment. "Sarah, how do you—" "We need to move them now," Sarah interrupted, already positioning herself to guide the extraction. "That vehicle's unstable. We have maybe 10 minutes before the fuel leak becomes a bigger problem." What happened next would be talked about in the emergency services community for months afterward. Sarah directed the extraction with the kind of calm authority that turned chaos into organized efficiency. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she stabilized injuries, controlled bleeding, and coordinated patient transfer. She anticipated Marcus's needs before he voiced them, provided clinical insights that probably saved 2 lives, and maintained perfect situational awareness throughout the entire operation. Jake watched in amazement as Sarah performed procedures he was certain weren't part of standard EMT training. When the passenger's condition suddenly deteriorated, she had already prepared the necessary interventions. When the driver showed signs of shock, she had anticipated it and positioned equipment accordingly. "Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus asked quietly as they loaded the second patient into their ambulance. Sarah was stripping off her gloves, her expression already returning to the carefully neutral mask she usually wore. "You pick things up," she said simply. But Marcus had been in this business long enough to recognize advanced trauma management when he saw it. What Sarah had just demonstrated wasn't something you picked up from driving ambulances. This was military-level field medicine, the kind of training that produced medics capable of keeping soldiers alive under the worst possible conditions. As they transported their patients to St. Mary's, Jake couldn't stop staring at Sarah. "That was incredible," he finally said. "I mean, I've never seen anything like that. You were like, I don't know, like you'd done it 1,000 times before." Word spread quickly through St. Mary's emergency department about the ambulance driver who had practically taken charge of a mass casualty incident. By the time Sarah and Jake returned from their transport, Patricia was waiting with a cup of coffee and a knowing look. "Heard you had an interesting call," Patricia said, offering Sarah the coffee. "Multiple vehicle accident," Sarah replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Nothing we couldn't handle." "According to Marcus, you handled things like someone with serious training. Military training." Sarah met Patricia's gaze steadily. Marcus was focused on his patients. Maybe he saw what he needed to see. Patricia smiled slightly. "You know what I think? I think you're someone who spent a lot of years in places where keeping people alive was the difference between coming home and not coming home. I think those scars on your hands came from performing medicine under conditions that would break most people. And I think you're working night shift ambulance routes because it's the closest you can get to that kind of work without having to explain where you learned to do it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the emergency department around them. Medical professionals moving with practiced efficiency, the controlled chaos of trauma medicine, the constant rhythm of people working to save lives. It was familiar in ways that made her chest tighten with memories she preferred to keep buried. "You know what the hardest part is?" Sarah finally said, her voice so quiet that Patricia had to lean in to hear her. "It's not the things you see or the things you have to do. It's coming back to a world where people think this," she gestured around the emergency department, "is intense. When you've worked in places where the nearest hospital is a helicopter ride away and the enemy is actively trying to kill your patients while you're trying to save them." Patricia nodded slowly. "How long were you deployed?" 4 tours, Sarah answered before she could stop herself. "Combat medic, special operations, forward operating bases in Afghanistan where we were the only medical support for 50 miles in any direction." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Patricia could see the weight of those deployments in Sarah's eyes, the accumulated stress of years spent performing medicine under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. "Every scar on my hands," Sarah continued, looking down at the faded marks, "represents a moment when someone's life depended on what I could do with whatever equipment I happened to have. Some of those scars came from shrapnel when we took incoming fire during surgery. Some came from working in conditions where sterile technique meant cleaning your instruments with whatever clean water you could find. And some came from the patients you couldn't save," Patricia added gently. Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Every medic loses patients. It's part of the job. But losing them in combat is different. When it's your friends, your unit. When you know that if you'd been faster or smarter or just a little bit luckier. Every scar is a life I couldn't save in Helmand Province," Sarah whispered, finally giving voice to the words that had been carrying for years. Patricia didn't push for details, recognizing the significance of what Sarah had just shared. Instead, she simply sat with her in the quiet corner of the emergency department, 2 medical professionals who understood that some experiences created wounds that never fully healed. "Why ambulance driving?" Patricia finally asked. "With your training, you could be working trauma surgery, emergency medicine. Hell, you could probably teach combat medicine." Sarah was quiet for a long time, watching the steady flow of patients and medical staff through the emergency department. Because driving ambulances doesn't require explaining why a 28-year-old woman knows how to perform emergency surgery with improvised tools. It doesn't require justifying why I wake up in a cold sweat when I hear helicopters. And it doesn't require admitting that I spent 3 years after my discharge drinking myself to sleep because I couldn't figure out how to live in a world where the biggest medical emergency most people face is a broken bone or a minor heart attack. Patricia nodded, understanding more than Sarah probably realized. Combat medicine breaks people in ways that civilian trauma never does. You're not just dealing with injuries, you're dealing with a deliberate attempt to destroy human life. And your job is to stand in the way of that destruction with nothing but your training and whatever equipment you can carry. Brief. "The worst part," Sarah continued, "is that I was good at it. Really good. I could keep someone alive in conditions that would be considered impossible by civilian standards. I could perform surgery in a bunker while taking mortar fire. I could manage multiple trauma patients with equipment that wouldn't meet basic standards in any American hospital. And when I came back, you felt useless, Patricia finished. I felt like I was pretending to be a medic. Like everything I'd learned, everything I'd done, everything that made me who I was professionally had been erased. In civilian medicine, they want certifications and licenses and proof that you learned things in approved ways. They don't care that you spent 4 years keeping soldiers alive in the most dangerous places on Earth. Sarah paused, staring down at her hands again. So I took a job that would let me help people without having to explain who I used to be. Ambulance driving is honest work. It's necessary work. And it lets me use some of my skills without having to tell stories about places that officially don't exist and missions that never happened. Patricia was beginning to understand the full scope of what Sarah was carrying. This wasn't just about combat trauma or difficult deployments. This was about someone who had performed at the highest levels of military medicine, being forced to hide their capabilities because the civilian world couldn't recognize or validate their experience. "What unit were you with?" Patricia asked carefully. Sarah looked at her sharply, as if suddenly remembering that she had revealed far more than she intended. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. Because I think you were with people who did things that don't make it into the official records. I think you were saving lives in places where admitting you were there would compromise national security. And I think that's why you can't just put combat medic on a resume and walk into any hospital in the country." Sarah was quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that she had been carrying alone for years. 75th Ranger Regiment. Attached medical support for special operations missions. The kind of deployments where your medical records are classified and your patient care reports never leave the Tactical Operations Center. Patricia felt a chill of recognition. She had heard whispers about medics attached to special operations units, stories about medical professionals who operated in the deepest levels of classified missions. These were people who saved lives in situations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, whose medical expertise was considered so valuable that their identities were protected as national security assets. "Jesus," Patricia whispered, "you were with the Rangers doing black operations." "I was with Americans doing their jobs," Sarah corrected firmly. "Everything else is just details." But Patricia understood now why Sarah was driving ambulances instead of working trauma surgery. People who had been embedded with special operations units couldn't simply transition to civilian medicine. Their training was too specialized, their experience too sensitive, their knowledge too valuable to be treated as just another medical professional looking for work. The emergency department had grown quieter as the night progressed toward dawn. Sarah and Patricia sat in comfortable silence, two women who understood that some conversations were too important to rush. "You know," Patricia finally said, "we could use someone with your background here, not officially, not in a way that would require extensive documentation, but someone who could provide consultation during mass casualty events, someone who could train our staff in trauma management techniques that go beyond standard protocols." Sarah looked at her skeptically. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you stop pretending to be just an ambulance driver, not publicly, not in ways that would compromise whatever security clearances you might still hold, but here, with us, where your experience could save lives." Sarah shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. I can't practice medicine without proper civilian credentials. The skills I have, the training I received, none of that translates to civilian medical licenses. I would need to go back to school, repeat training I've already completed, prove my competency in ways that don't acknowledge what I actually know how to do." "Who says you'd be practicing medicine?" Patricia smiled. "You'd be doing exactly what you're doing now. Driving ambulances, transporting patients, working with our emergency response teams. The only difference is that when situations arise that require advanced trauma management, like tonight, you wouldn't have to pretend you don't know what you're doing." Sarah considered this carefully. The idea of being able to use her training openly, even in limited circumstances, was both appealing and terrifying. For 3 years, she had maintained carefully constructed boundaries around her capabilities, never allowing herself to demonstrate the full scope of what she could do. It had been a form of self-protection, but it had also been a form of professional suicide. What about questions? What about people wanting to know where I learned things? You let me handle that, Patricia replied. I've been working emergency medicine long enough to know when to ask questions and when to simply be grateful for competent help. The important thing is that we'd have someone with your capabilities available when we need them. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks and benefits of Patricia's proposal. On one hand, it would mean acknowledging her military background in ways that she had been avoiding for years. On the other hand, it would allow her to use her skills to save lives, which was why she had become a medic in the first place. There's something else, Sarah finally said. Something you should know before you make any decisions about what kind of person you want working here. Patricia waited, sensing that Sarah was approaching something difficult. I didn't just treat combat injuries during my deployments. I treated civilian casualties, children caught in crossfire, enemy combatants who were wounded during operations. Some of the people I saved were probably responsible for killing Americans. Some of the lives I preserved went on to cause more death and destruction. Sarah's voice carried the weight of moral complexity that came from practicing medicine in war zones. There were times when I kept people alive, knowing that they would be interrogated, knowing that the information they provided might save or cost other lives. There were times when I had to choose who to treat first, based on intelligence value rather than medical need. Patricia absorbed this information without visible reaction. She understood that combat medicine involved ethical decisions that had no equivalent in civilian practice. Did you ever refuse treatment to someone who needed it? Patricia asked quietly. Never, Sarah answered immediately. That's not what we do. You treat everyone to the best of your ability, regardless of who they are or what they've done. But you make decisions about resource allocation, evacuation priority, treatment sequences. And sometimes those decisions are influenced by factors that have nothing to do with medicine. That's not unique to military medicine, Patricia pointed out. We make those same kinds of decisions here every night. When multiple trauma patients arrive simultaneously, we have to prioritize treatment based on survivability, resource requirements, likelihood of successful outcomes. The only difference is that our decisions aren't complicated by considerations of national security. Sarah looked surprised. You're not bothered by the things I just told you? I'm bothered by the fact that you've been carrying the weight of those decisions alone for 3 years, Patricia replied. I'm bothered by the fact that someone with your training and experience has been convinced that civilian medicine has no place for the skills you developed under the most difficult conditions imaginable. And I'm bothered by the idea that we might lose the opportunity to benefit from your expertise because you think your military service somehow disqualifies you from continuing to save lives. As the first light of dawn began filtering through the emergency department windows, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since her discharge, someone was suggesting that her military medical experience was an asset rather than a liability, that the skills she had developed in combat could be valuable in civilian medicine. If I agreed to this, Sarah said slowly, what would it actually look like? It would look like exactly what happened tonight, Patricia answered. You would continue working as an ambulance driver, but when situations arise that require advanced trauma management, you would provide medical support as needed. No formal role changes, no official recognition, no documentation that might compromise security considerations. Just one medical professional helping another when lives are at stake. Sarah nodded slowly. And the scars on my hands? Are evidence that you learned to save lives under conditions that most people can't imagine. Every scar represents knowledge gained, skills developed, lives preserved. They're not something to hide. They're something to honor. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she might be able to stop pretending to be less than she was. The scars on her hands would always be reminders of the patients she couldn't save in Helmand province, but perhaps they could also be evidence of her continuing commitment to preserving life. As her shift ended and she walked toward the hospital parking lot, Sarah realized that she was no longer running from her past. She was finally ready to let her experience serve others again, even if it meant acknowledging that some wounds never fully heal and some scars tell stories that can never be completely shared. The ambulance driver with the gentle hands and hidden scars was finally coming home.